Hardware to Save a Planet explores the technical innovations that are giving us hope in the fight against climate change. Each episode focuses on a specific climate challenge and explores an emerging physical technology solution with the person bringing it into reality. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett. Hello and welcome to Hardware to Save a Planet. I'm here today with Laura Teicher, the president and executive director of Forge. Forge is a nonprofit that helps companies bring physical products from prototypes through to commercialization and impact at scale. Their roots are in climate tech. They spun out of Greentown Labs, but they also support companies in other sectors. I thought the work Forge is doing would be a good topic for our audience for a couple of reasons. One is that they're a really valuable resource I think more startups building hardware should know about. We originally got connected because one of my guests, Daniel White from Clean Crop, has worked with Forge and spoke really highly of the support they provided. The other reason is that I wanted to explore the value of local manufacturing, not just to our economy, but to our climate. To introduce Laura quickly, she has been the executive director of Forge for around 5 years. During that time, they have grown from supporting around 40 companies per year on the hardware commercialization journey to now 300 companies per year. She has also grown the team from 2 people to more than 10. Through this growth, she has also impacted the local supply chain, facilitating more than $45 million worth of contracts to U.S. manufacturers. I've heard Laura say that she got lucky finding Forge, but it looks to me like Forge was also lucky to find her as well. Laura, it's really awesome to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me. Excited for the conversation today.
I find it really fun and interesting that you and I are doing something very similar today, in that we're both supporting hardware companies along the path to commercialization, but we've come at this from very different places. I saw you started your career in politics and policy, working in a senator's office early on. What was your path from there to what you're doing today?
Meandering.
Yeah.
So it hasn't been a straight path. I like to be very upfront about that. But my whole career has really been about figuring out where I can be the most impactful, where I can have the greatest impact. That's part of why I went into the policy work. And also, ultimately, from there, ended up getting my MBA because I was already hitting my head on the ceiling a little bit with the degrees that I had. And that is what allowed me ultimately to get into executive director level work. And very quickly, I just through Kismet ended up focused on supporting innovation. And so my first executive director role was with an innovation support organization, part of TIE, which is the largest global not-for-profit network dedicated to fostering entrepreneurship. And I was always drawn to helping with the climate tech startups, especially while I was there. And so I had my eye on Greentown Labs. I was thinking maybe that would be a place for me in the future. And it was through a conversation with the then CEO of Greentown Labs that I learned about what we refer to as Greentown Labs' sister organization, which is now Forge. And this organization was built to help specifically with creating the physical products that are needed to affect change in the world. So when we're talking about climate change and the impacts of climate change, real physical impacts in the world, rising temperatures, rising seas, destabilized power grids. And in order to really solve these challenges, it usually requires a physical product or at least a component that plugs into the real world so that AI can be deployed and leveraged, right?
Absolutely.
And so when Greentown Labs was built, the largest climate tech incubator in North America, very quickly there was recognition that Greentown Labs sat within this very robust innovation ecosystem in New England, Northeast US, but there really was no one helping with the actual manufacturing of the thing, which is a really long-winded way to come around to this issue that when you are building physical products, when you are innovating in the physical space, this is actually where a tremendous amount of your capital is concentrated early on. It's where a tremendous amount of risk is concentrated. It makes it slower to grow and harder to fundraise. There's so many unique challenges here. And so what is now Forge was created to help innovators with their product development, manufacturing strategies, and domestic supply chains. And we spun out of Greentown Labs. We now serve any sector. As you shared, we serve quite a large number of companies a year. And I'm excited to dig in a little more during this podcast to how specifically we do that.
Yeah. I want to hear more about what kind of this idea that there was this gap in helping companies with manufacturing. It's interesting to me because there's such a broad and active ecosystem of various organizations supporting startups. That just feels like that's a big miss. And is it just because so much of that ecosystem is focused on software startups, or why do you think that is?
I think there are layers to it. One layer is a very well-intentioned layer. There's something called the Lean Business Canvas that's been adopted by the support ecosystem that's very focused on business planning and team building and fundraising, and really doesn't dig in specifically to the unique challenges around manufacturing the physical thing. And that sort of became adopted universally as the sort of the holy grail of how do you support startups? How do you think through really quickly what are the core things you need in place in order to grow and scale? But it was fundamentally informed by software and by growing software. And there was, when the ecosystem was nascent, I think a very well-intentioned lack of recognition that hardware is different, hardware is hard, and you need special and additive support when you're actually building something. So that's one layer. There's certainly a layer of the innovation support ecosystem at times and in places being very focused on venture investability. And as I think probably our audience is well aware, the venture community likes to see very aggressive potential growth, 40x, 100x growth in just a handful of years. It's a lot harder to achieve with hardware, especially first of its kind solutions to climate tech. You're talking sometimes a 10-year journey to get to full deployment. And that's just not as attractive to a majority of investors. About 3% of investment goes to hardware, period. The news is a little better on the climate side right now than in other areas. And then finally, it's really hard to help hardware companies. It takes truly a village to build a first of its kind new product. You're talking about engineers, folks who have expertise in design for manufacturing, design for scale, design for assembly. You've all of the folks that are supplying the raw materials and the machinists that are forming it into what you need. You have people who actually put the product together and package it and ship it out. There's so much that goes into it. And all of these services exist in the private sector. But what you have is a mismatch between the need and the way the free market serves it. So these innovators often need a lot more support earlier before they've hit the level of traction where they can afford to pay the private sector for some of this physical building and de-risking support. So this is where Forge being a nonprofit comes into play. And as a nonprofit, we're really focused on creating access and democratizing the ability to get in front of experts, to get expert advice around building your product. Because everything I just described earlier, to a certain extent, becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. This company may not be investable, so we're not going to support it, so it's not going to move along, so it's not going to get investable. What we've shown at Forge, I think over and over again, is just a little bit of targeted support, making sure you avoid the most common pitfalls in readiness to scale manufacturing before you go into production. Just a little bit of help getting in front of the right partners for your needs, just a little bit of help making sure you have all of your paperwork in order for steps to release. Little interventions can make a really huge difference on the journey of these companies. And they can, in fact, go on to scale and deploy. And that can be through unlocking that investment, or a lot of companies find different pathways to sort of bootstrap and become profitable sooner because that's what hardware needs. It's a very long-winded answer, but it's complicated.
Yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, and then we had to figure out how do we make this work financially to give more access to these innovative companies sooner. And fundamentally, we have to be a nonprofit to do it that way.
Tell me more about that. What's important about being a nonprofit, and then how do you fund your operations?
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked with over 800 emerging hard tech companies at this point. And about 20% of them are in what we call mature production at Forge, which is a really incredible number when you look at the typical failure rates for startups, period, let alone hardware startups, which are more challenging. We have not been charging for this help.
Mm-hmm.
And as we continue to grow, we will be tiering our services and we will have to charge for some things. But what we've been able to do is assemble a network of experts around us. So we have over 600 manufacturers and suppliers that actually want to work with innovative companies. That can be really challenging for an emerging company to even get a call back if they cold outreach to manufacturers. But our manufacturing network knows that we're doing everything we can to make sure these companies are truly ready to talk to them, and then that we've really robust data systems to make sure it's a match and no one's time is wasted. But if we weren't here, the average company that we work with, number one, they wouldn't be able to get out in front of a lot of those manufacturers. They would sort of default to whoever actually called them back. They often default overseas, assume they can't make it here. And they'd be unlikely to get the expert advice we give them when they come to us for that help, and we're able to intervene around readiness to have those conversations, because a lot of these founders are deeply technical. And so the last thing they often think they need is technical help. They may need a supplier, but they're highly unlikely to identify their own blind spots in technical readiness. And yet, most of the founders we work with have not scaled production before. They don't have a background in manufacturing. These are two very different technical disciplines. Whatever variety of engineering or technical know-how they may be coming from, they still may not understand all the fundamental things you have to get in order to have a productive conversation with manufacturers. And further, what we've seen is a lot of innovators will leap into production without considering, for example, the testing and certifications they'll need to go into a highly regulated marketplace, or without considering all of the design for disciplines. And what that means is if they're with the wrong manufacturing partners, they're not going to consider it their problem. They'll just go ahead and make the thing, even if they know it won't scale or work. Or what's really sad is then a lot of money can be spent, a lot of runway can be burned on a design that won't ultimately get to the marketplace that's needed or the scale that's needed. And by the time those gaps are identified, it's so much more costly to walk it back.
Yeah.
And so without Forge in the middle, these companies will often waste time and money on the wrong processes and the wrong partners, but they're not going to pay an expensive private consultant to tell them that.
Right.
So we build trust. We're accessible as they're thinking through evolving their product or hitting the next scale. And then we're able to gently raise the point. I see you plan to do this in very high tolerances, which is going to be expensive. And yet your use case, can you tell me why you need really high tolerances? Sometimes it's as simple as that. Or I see you have 80 different pieces to this thing and you've handmade them all. It looks like 30 of them could be bought off the shelf for cheaper. These sorts of considerations can often be missed. Companies can leap into spending tremendous amounts of money on manufacturing before they're ready or with the wrong partners. And that's not something that the private sector can solve for at this time, because these innovators are not going to pay some expensive consultant to tell them that at that stage.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot at Synapse, and we see this dynamic where it's so much easier and cheaper to make design changes, for example, before you go to manufacturing, early in the process.
Yes.
Once you've got a manufacturing line, you've got a CM, you're locked into a certain path, and any diversion from that path can be super expensive in time and money. I definitely see that. And this is helpful. It sounds like it's unlocking this chicken and egg problem for early stage startups, where if you're this early, you don't have the money to get the advice you need and to get to the stage where you're a more investable, lower risk startup for VCs to look at. So you're able to get them over that hump.
And I do want to clarify, VC investment is just one potential source of traction and positive outcome here. Again, that's we really try to be very open and frank too with our startups about the fact that not all of them will get VC investment and that they have to be creative in thinking about other pathways to scalability. Because as I shared, a very small percentage of VC funding even goes to hardware in the first place.
And then how are you funded?
Yes. We are largely funded by mission-aligned money from governments and private foundations. Sometimes it can be regionally focused or sector focused. And then we also have a sponsorship program. So I mentioned how we have this network of suppliers that we've actually vetted and cataloged and want to work with innovators, which is really exciting. Importantly, they do not have to pay us anything to be in our network, to get referrals, but more and more of them are deciding to sponsor Forge because they're seeing how we fit in with their business model, with their goals of making more innovative products so they can attract the rising workforce, so they can stay abreast of cutting edge emerging technologies, and so that they have their forward-looking potential business client portfolio. We work with a lot of local and regional manufacturers, CMs. In New England, that's mostly small and medium shops. So it's really compelling when they're then saying, actually, we don't have to give money to Forge, but we want to. These are often relatively thin margin businesses. They've been in the family for a couple of years. They may historically have been a little more risk adverse. Not only do they want to work with our startups, but that's become another source of revenue for Forge as well. And then in the future, we will be adding some more tiered services that we can charge for some deeper engagements when startups choose to engage with us in that way.
I want to spend a little time on what it looks like for a startup to engage with you, what time in their evolution that should happen. But first, I know that the other kind of theme with what you're doing is about local manufacturing or domestic manufacturing.
Yes.
So I wanted to hear from you, why is that important? What does that mean to these companies, to our economy, and then also for the climate? Why is that important?
Absolutely. The reason why we were initially created was to help innovators who need to build a thing to build a thing. And one of the realizations that led to this was seeing this cluster of, at the time, a couple of dozen climate tech companies at Greentown Labs. Now it's hundreds. And then the robustness of the New England supply chain. This idea, would you all like to talk to each other? Would you all like to work together? And what was quickly apparent was we started unlocking some significant competitive advantages for the innovators that were engaging with the local supply chain. So pre-pandemic, what this looked like primarily was just the ability, when you're in the early stages of iteration and figuring out how to best scale your production, the ability to drive down the road, go and see the thing come off the production line, talk directly to the people working on it. That tight communication and that short loop from making the thing to seeing the thing to discussing the thing, really valuable at the early stages of innovation. Then we also saw a lot of these companies, again, trying to get into highly regulated markets and doing first of their kind, very big builds. And so we saw there were advantages when you're working on really high precision issues and need really specific expertise. For example, we work with a lot of medical device, so folks that fully understand the FDA approval process. We work with a lot of climate tech, so folks who understand all the complicated regulations around things like plugging into transmission lines. This can be really helpful. And what we saw, which was really exciting, was that anecdotally, all of the companies we were working with were going to default to sourcing overseas. They assumed they had to. They assumed they couldn't make it here. They assumed it wouldn't be affordable to make it here. But once they had gone through Forge and they'd figured out they could make it here, 75% kept coming back for local supply chain referrals. I always say startups vote with their feet, right? They may not fill out all of our surveys like we would hope, but if they're coming back and they're asking for more referrals, they're telling us that they see value in working with the local supply chain. And then, of course, the pandemic years hit. And we were really out in front of it, trying to warn our startups that their supply chains would be disrupted. And a few of them were able to listen to that advanced knowledge. Many of them had their livelihoods rocked by those delays. And obviously, there's become now a rising awareness that localization helps with resiliency. It helps to eliminate global supply chain disruptions and delays, communication challenges, helps with IP protection. So we're seeing this sort of natural turning of the world towards maybe I should at least have some local options, even if I don't want to buy everything locally. And then you come back around to the climate of it all, which is obviously a big part of why I'm here. And people really underestimate the impact of having hyper globalized supply chains on the environment. It means you're getting a raw material here, and then you're shipping it there, and then you're forming it here, and then you're shipping it again, you're machining it. And all of this adds up. It's a tremendous amount of whether it's cargo boats or planes, fuels being used to drive raw materials, half assembled products back and forth across the world. And so when we can help companies to hyper localize, it can help speed up the earlier processes, help them get into higher scale production sooner. It can save them some of those hidden costs and challenges with hyper globalized supply chains. And importantly, it can drastically reduce their scope 3 emissions and the overall carbon footprint of making the product. And it's interesting how you see a lot of innovators innately pay attention to production and process on the sustainability side. So, is my manufacturer using renewable energy? Are we using materials that can come through a full life cycle like bamboo? But you don't see a lot of innate thinking about what is the impact of my supply chain. And I think we're going to see more attention to that in the future. We're actually seeing more investment in it from government and private sector. And I think a rising awareness. So it's really cool to be able to help with this localization because we've seen it increase outcomes for the startups, drive economic value to our local manufacturers, and reduce the carbon footprint of these cool, innovative things that are being made.
I imagine it depends a lot on the kind of hardware we're talking about and the scale and the size of the systems and things like that. But do you have any way to quantify how significant that is if a company is looking at manufacturing locally versus overseas? Is how meaningful is that in the scheme of things?
We actually are developing a tool to help startups assess this for themselves, where we can break down what are the key inputs that you have, where do you think you would get them from, what's the most likely way it would be shipped, what's the impact of that. There's not a quick and easy answer, clearly.
Yeah.
But I think giving our innovators are so smart and so curious. So just giving them access to this information and tools where they can play around with modeling it, I think can go a really long way.
As a startup, and for anyone listening to this who's in this kind of hardware startup world, what's the right time to reach out to you? How do they do that? And then maybe you can walk us through what to expect, what kinds of support you provide and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. We like to talk about at Forge is really 3 pillars of how we help innovators. And the first one's education. So that's interactive workshops and workbooks and factory tours and peer-to-peer learning through meetups, that sort of thing. And that really, it's never too soon to engage, in my opinion. I think exposure to some of these concepts early can be a real game changer. So even if you're just thinking about making a product, and you're purely at the idea stage, it might be valuable to attend some of our more educational events. And then the second pillar is connection. So that's when we're actually making curated introductions to our supply chain partners and also to our ecosystem collaborators. So Forge only helps with product development, manufacturing, and supply chain. There are hundreds of other organizations around us that focus on other things startups need. We are a little more gated about when we start making supply chain referrals. We have to make sure the startup is really as ready as they say they are, that we have the right information to make sure that they're an appropriate match for who we're referring them to. And of course, they have to actually have money to spend with the supplier, or it's a little bit of a waste of everyone's time. So if a company is at a point where they have at least a looks like or works like prototype and a desire to connect the local supply chain and an appropriate budget for what they're trying to source with the supply chain, that's when they can engage with the connection side of things on the supply chain network. And then finally, we have a little more of a nascent pillar, which is funding. We do give away non-dilutive grants. We call them Forge Product Development Grants. And this comes back to the chicken and egg conversation about all the challenges in hardware. We see so often these gaps between moments where startups can get non-dilutive or dilutive funding, can get traction in the form of early customers or pilots. Oftentimes, you need a slightly more sophisticated prototype to unlock any of those opportunities. And so we found small injections of cash to be used specifically for those product development challenges. As little as $5,000 to ruggedize a robot can open up massive opportunities around the corner.
Do you have any, if you're able to, any specific examples of ways in which you've helped a company get over one of these fundings? Ruggedizing a robot is an interesting one, or just to bring it to life a little bit, and especially in the climate tech space.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting on some patterns and where we've seen really transformative help, especially in the climate tech space. And I would say it's usually around when they are working through how to scale up production. And that can be something as simple as they've demonstrated feasibility, but they can only do a few centimeters of the new material that they're working on. And they need a whole new piece of equipment to actually make anything bigger than that. And they need to think through what is the right equipment and how do I get money for that equipment and all of that. So that's a really common one. And then actually the ruggedization thing comes up a lot. Because again, if you're talking about deploying physical products out into the environment to help with climate change, they're often outside. You have wind farms and solar farms and things that are to get rained on and dust on, or you have solutions that you're deploying into highly industrial spaces or sewers. And oftentimes folks have proven that the product does what it's supposed to do, but it's not yet at a place where it could be deployed for 5 years without a tremendous amount of maintenance. So these are really common scenarios. And I'd say on that ruggedization side, I hinted at this story earlier. We worked a long time ago with a company called BioBot. They are analyzing wastewater, so sewage, for public health information. And when we were first engaging with them, their beachhead market was to help monitor opioid use in certain regions, and then to also monitor the impact of those interventions, because you can collect real-time information about aggregate health from the sewers. This was the robots that needed to go into the sewers to collect this data. I love this founding team. They used to personally go down into the sewers to collect it themselves before they had the robots, which shows their core product is actually the algorithm and how they analyze all of that data. But in order for it to have any value to the world, you need to be able to scale, scooping all that poop and being able to analyze it. And so they came to us, they had the robots, they were deploying them. They needed to make them shock proof and corrosion proof and all of these other things, because you can imagine these are hostile environments. And this is a perfect example of not only did we pair them with the supplier that helps them work through how to do that physically with their products, but we gave them the money to do it. It wasn't a lot of money. Shortly thereafter, COVID hit, and it was very clear that another application of this tech was monitoring COVID. And in very short order, these robots were deployed in almost every state in the country, helping us with some of the best data we had about the ebb and flow of COVID. And then they applied it to monkeypox and other emerging threats. But you can see what a flexible and incredible innovation this is. We're so excited these robots are out in the world and ready for deployment. But help was needed to be in that position where they could pivot and move fast when this use case of COVID arrives.
That's a great example. And it's helpful too, because at least in my view of it, that sounds like that was a design challenge, like a design and engineering challenge they were up against to make this more, their robots more ruggedized. As much as I think we were also talking about kind of manufacturing relationships and supplier relationships for components and contract manufacturing, but it sounds like you're also able to help people get connections on the kind of engineering and design portion of the development.
Yes. And to be fair, those tend to be slightly more interesting stories than someone said they need this really specific mold and we found them this really specific mold.
Right.
But we have plenty of those cases too.
So if somebody reaches out, is there a process of evaluating where they are and which pillar of those three you talked about is the right place for them to be engaging in at that stage?
A very common way for startups to come in is through our website. There's a place where you can schedule a meeting and it asks a few sorting questions to help us route you correctly. But if you have a prototype and you're looking for supply chain referrals, you get routed one way. And that way will involve a one-to-one meeting with a program team member where we'll make sure we have all the right data. There's a quick onboarding form first, but there's so much that can be lost in that. We then do is sit down, make sure we see the prototype itself or the design files, whatever steps to release files folks have, really get a sense of where the company's at and what they need. And if they're as ready as they think they are, the next step is those direct referrals. If we see some gaps, we will recommend that they pause and maybe engage in some of our educational support to fill those gaps before they go to the suppliers. But if you come that way through the website, you can also get routed just to a Forge intro session. That's just to learn a little more about how we can help on the journey. We may end up referring you to an ecosystem collaborator to help with your business plan or something at that point. And then, of course, from the website, you can also just sign right up for upcoming events.
Yeah, just to say, I think even if the answer when they come to you is actually you're not ready to go talk to suppliers, that's got to be a really valuable feedback to get as well. To your point earlier, that can save a ton of time and money just going back and doing a little more work that needs to happen before you're really ready for those supplier engagements.
Time, money, and relationships. It's perfectly reasonable to go to a supplier and say, in the future, I will be doing this. And if you're willing, I'd love your expert advice and insights on it. But what can happen, and I think it's very well intentioned, is I'm ready to make this. Talk to me now. And then if the supplier finds you're not ready, they're unlikely to talk to you again. So there's also this element of if you've identified a really valuable potential manufacturing partner, not jumping the gun so that you actually can work with them in the future. And we can help with all of that too. But that honesty and that sorting is really important, not just for you if you want to work with manufacturers, but for the whole innovation ecosystem. Please don't burn them by going in unready.
Good point. Where do you see the future of Forge? What do you hope? You've been doing this for 5 years. What do you hope to see in 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
We've been on a little bit of a growth path. We have a handful of offices. They're all in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And that means our supply chain network is really in New England currently. But innovators are finding us from across the country and around the world. This targeted help is really unusual. It's unique. It's needed. We want to keep growing this thing. We want to be connecting up with others who are like-minded, who maybe just have the educational offering. We can help build out the supply chain network piece and then connect it up across the country. Because as we keep growing, there are different capabilities in different regions, and we want to be able to make the most local referrals possible for the startups because we really do see value in that for them. Our goal is to keep growing where these clusters of innovation and manufacturing exists that we can plug into and support, and where it's going to be sustainable for Forge to remain and grow over time. So that doesn't necessarily look like a Forge in every city in the US, but the more we can connect the dots between the innovators and the manufacturers, which are both so strong in this country, I think the more impact we have, and that's why we're here. So expect us to keep growing in the future.
Are there any sectors within climate tech that you see as particularly attractive growth areas for Forge or for this industry generally?
I see a real strong emphasis that's grown over the past 10 years. If you look at the investments going into climate, the three big growth areas have been renewable energy, electric transportation, and grid connectivity. And I don't think those trends are going to wildly change, but I think We're all getting more specialized and more knowledgeable. And one of the things buried in that renewable energy and storage is the advanced materials needed to have more effective battery storage. I think this is going to continue to be a huge area of focus.
I know the Biden administration has been ramping up tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods and EVs and steel and aluminum. Without getting political, I'm just curious to know, does that have a big impact in your world and the kind of work you're doing?
It's complicated. One thing we always say at Forge is as much as we believe in the power of localization, that doesn't mean we're saying don't make anything anywhere else. Everyone has to make the decisions that are right for their business. And there are economies of scale on certain things. There are certain raw materials you can't even get here. So Forge isn't coming at it from a protectionist angle. But what I will say is localization gets de-incentivized when the economics are skewed, sometimes by, for example, labor practices that I think some startups maybe wouldn't actually want to be buying into. So what it does is make it more likely that we are going to have more of these energy supply chains built out domestically. It kind of forces the issue. I think it's part of the package of everything they're trying to do. And some of this is never going to go away for innovators who want to work with the DOE, for example. They do have domestic supply chain requirements. This is just another way to sort of put the finger on the scale of the economics of the thing. And so it will spur more local production. The challenge is we don't know what the landscape's going to look like in 1 year. A lot of things could change in a year. There's a lot of attention and investment on climate innovation and domestic manufacturing right now, but there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen a year from now. So there's a little bit of it. We all have to step back and just see how this plays out, I think.
Okay. I ask these last questions of everybody. The first is, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of the planet and why?
I don't think it would be possible to do my job if I didn't suffer from optimism. I do use the term suffer from optimism. I'm surrounded every day by really passionate, hardworking, brilliant people who are dedicating their lives to this issue. So when I talk, for example, to one of our startups who I like to say is making energy out of thin air, and they will bop me on the head because they're actually pulling energy out of the humidity in the air. I could never think of that. That gives me hope, right?
Yeah.
When I look at the speed of our policy making and the reticence of big industry to move at the pace we need, I'm someone who thinks about the fact that we may all have a less stable grid in not too far distant future and what that looks like on an individual and personal level. I think it's possible to be incredibly optimistic, incredibly dedicated, and also a little bit concerned. And that's where I would say I fall today.
Who is one other person or company doing something to address climate change that's inspiring you?
I've always been a huge fan of Clean Crop. I'll say something that they wouldn't say. I think they're going to solve world hunger. They would say they're just helping us to not lose 30% of staple crops to mold and fungus with this new cold plasma application that can actually scale, and we can actually retrieve all of this lost food. But food loss and food waste is a huge contributor to the challenges we're having with the planet. So I will say I really look up to Clean Crop, but my real answer is actually my team at Forge. We're helping companies that are solving really tough problems, and we have to solve really tough problems in order to help those companies. And there's never a dull moment. When you're serving hundreds of companies a year, you're switching from different processes and challenges and scalability issues really quickly. And the team is incredibly dedicated and nimble and committed to being solution oriented. And it's really inspiring. This job isn't always easy, but the thing that kind of keeps me inspired is, number one, seeing the cool technologies we're enabling, but number two, seeing the dedication of the team. And they just don't quit. They're really cool and inspiring to work with.
Love it. What advice do you have for someone not working in climate tech today who wants to do something to help?
This is great because I've been having a lot of these conversations lately. Maybe not something to help, but people who want to get into climate tech who aren't in climate tech currently. And I think some of the most important pieces of advice that have come up organically in recent introductory interviews with folks trying to get their foot in the door. Number one is really being able to call out and articulate what cross-applicable skills you have. So, for example, I was talking to someone who's a product manager who has deep product management experience, bringing a product from 0 to 100, including IoT integration. But somehow that wasn't really articulated on their resume, and they weren't really front-loading it in the conversation. And I said, there's always a need for product people. And the fact that you can deal with IoT integration and have been the arc from 0 to 100, that's incredibly valuable. Think about what you can articulate that will be needed in this sector. I also say know your gaps, talk to people about the types of jobs you want, listen to them if they tell you there are certain things missing from your resume or your experience, and then backfill them. Do it through certifications, volunteerism. That's not the end of the story. It's just identify what you need to fill in and fill it in. There are a bunch of different ways to do that. And then finally, my networking advice, which is to never burn bridges, because I was trying to get a job at Greentown Labs when I ended up with this job. I was turned down for that job for a very good reason. I hadn't run lab space before. But my approach to that was, I still love what you're doing. I would still love to find a way to engage with this community. And that led to the door being open to apply for this job. So even if you get that initial no, or things aren't going quite as you hope, keep building those relationships. Don't burn bridges. You never know where that opportunity will come out. And these are all very real pieces of advice I've given to real human beings in the last couple of weeks.
Great advice. Laura, thank you very much for your time and for what you're doing. I hope this helps you make some new connections with startups doing innovative hardware. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you for having me.
Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. To find out more about us and how we develop hardware solutions for the world's most ambitious companies, head to synapse.com. And then make sure to search for Hardware to Save a Planet in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere you like to listen. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Synapse, thanks for listening.